sort of standard theological definition. This is just my wording of what these two things can be described as. Temptation is an enticement to do that which is evil or to not do that which is good and right. Yeah, there are times when we are tempted to do certain things, and there are times when we are tempted to not do what we are supposed to do. So in theology, they call it sins of omission and sins of commission. Sin is transgression or violation of God's moral standards. So one is enticement, the other one is actual violation. God's moral standards are so high that it is possible to sin without committing the act itself. So our desires, our thoughts and intentions can be sinful. So when we talk about sin, we're not talking just about what you do. Sometimes it's what you think and what you might say without actually doing something. That's how high God's moral standard is. And when we talk about sin, is a violation of that standard. It means that it could be done internally, and very often it's done internally. Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 verse 27 was talking about the Jewish tradition. It says that you have heard that you shall not commit adultery, for instance, and we think, well, I'm not going to commit adultery. But listen to what Jesus says in verse 28. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So keep in mind, that's the standard of God of what sin is. You could sin in your heart. And some people don't commit certain sins because they just don't have the courage to go ahead and do it, but in their heart, they actually do so. So a person may be steeped and bound in lustful passions like pornography, and they'll watch on the internet and so on, but they will not go out there and actually commit adultery, but they are lusting for people in their heart. That's sin, even though you haven't committed it yet. That's what I mean by God's high moral standards. But note, for the purposes of this question, that the two, temptation and sin, are not the same. Temptation, or the capacity to be tempted, remains with every one of us as long as we are alive and in this world which has been, of course, corrupted by sin. We're always going to be tempted. Temptation is common to all people. It's common. Everybody faces some form of temptation. The type of temptation may vary, but we all experience temptation. I use the word continually. It's there all the time. The only time you will not experience temptation is when you're dead. So let's look at what the Bible says about Jesus and temptations. You know, of course, Jesus was tempted. We see that in Matthew 4, Luke 4, and it just records there 3 types of temptations that he actually faced and overcame. But in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 15, it says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points, tempted as we are, yet without sin." I'll read this now from the New Living Translation, 2nd edition, where it says, "This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testings," this version renders it, "we do, yet he did not sin." So this tells us that temptation is not sin. Jesus faced temptation of all forms. You might have been tested in a lot of areas, but definitely not in all areas. Jesus was tempted in all points, at all points, or all areas. And the Bible says, however, yet without sin. So get that clear. Temptation is not sin. Everybody faces temptation, just as Jesus did. Jesus does never yield to it. So Jesus was tempted, and so will you and I. It simply confirms, temptation simply confirms that there's a devil, and we are alive, and we are being tempted or targeted by the devil. That's what it means. Temptation becomes sin when we yield to the temptation. And you could yield, like I said, in your thoughts. As a man, I could be tempted sexually if I see a woman scantily dressed there, or on some image on television. You're watching a movie and it's the wrong type of show with all types of things. looking and having your eyes fall on it, you realize temptation comes. But choosing to remain looking and staring and lusting, that's sin. Even though you may not commit the act, but you are going too far. And sometimes we go too far with our thoughts, and it crosses the border between temptation and actual sin. And so as long as we don't yield to it in words, thoughts, or deeds, there ought not to be any feelings of guilt or condemnation. If probably you ask this question because you feel guilty because you're facing temptations of a certain type. No, if you're not yielding to it internally or externally, there's no need to feel condemned. Sometimes we have an overactive conscience that makes us feel bothered that something wrong with me. Why am I feeling this temptation? Well, it's because you're alive. That's why, but don't yield to it. So in closing, temptation is the devil's design. That's in the previous part of the question. It asks about, does God tempt us or test us? So temptation is the devil's design to weaken and break you down in certain areas so that you may eventually sin and slip into bondage. That's what temptation is all about. But the temptation itself is not sin. It's when you yield in some form to these desires and passions, that's where sin becomes manifested. And so don't feel guilty if temptation is there. It will come. It's how you treat with it. If you choose to yield, then it becomes sin. So I hope that helps in response to that part of your question. My name is Patrick Antoine. Thank you for both parts of the question. And again, I trust that I helped you in some way. So until the next time, grace and